Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the second weekend of November 2024. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent nonprofit nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divounguy, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. We'll look at President-elect Donald Trump's road to 270. We'll hear a roundup of ballot initiatives from across several states on abortion rights and recreational marijuana. And we'll discuss the significant congressional races that impacted the balance of power in the U.S. House and Senate. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on President-elect Donald Trump's electoral victory, it's Dan McCaleb.
Former President Donald Trump is now President-elect Trump after his historic win in Tuesday's election. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, we've been saying for months that this was a tight presidential race. Turns out it wasn't. What happened?
Well, Dan, we did intimate this for weeks and weeks, which is that Trump had a slight lead in every swing state. And it turns out if those slight leads all panned out, those electoral votes pile up. And so in some sense, it was close in the swing states. Trump did not win these swing states by 10 points, but it was not close in the sense that he won basically all of them, which was not expected. And of course, the votes are still being counted. And, we don't want to overstate anything, but he's really dominated Kamala. It's no other way to put it. He's on track to be well over 300 electoral votes and, leading the popular vote by 4 million. I think that's the most surprising part, Dan, when you talk about it wasn't close, is the popular vote. Because you could say, well, every swing state was pretty close and he just happened to win every swing state narrowly. So, those votes piled up. But the popular vote wasn't close at all. He's the first Republican to win the popular vote since 2004 when George W. Bush did so. Romney, didn't win it. Even even Trump, he was elected, didn't win the popular vote the first time around. So that is really the most amazing part of all this to me, is that he ran up the total on the popular vote, really crushed Kamala, sweeping win in the Senate. Republicans will have control of the Senate, and it looks, it's still too early to say definitively, but it looks like they're on track to have a narrow lead in the House as well. So really a ringing endorsement, as some have said, for Trump, for Republicans, for his agenda. Trump's calling it a mandate, and I think he has every right to do that right now.
So let's talk about the swing states here for a minute. The swing states on the eastern side of the company, including the blue wall of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He swept all three of those. He also won Georgia and North Carolina. So, the voters resoundingly rejected Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign, essentially, in favor of Trump. Now, Arizona and Nevada are still to be determined. Votes are still being counted. But the last I checked, Trump has significant leads in the two states. What I'm looking at here is 52% to 46% in Arizona, 51% to 47% in Nevada. So while votes are still being counted there, it's likely, in my non-expert analysis, going to be a clean sweep of the swing states. Now, on the popular vote side, Trump, the last I checked there, had about a 4 million vote lead. There are still plenty of votes to be counted, particularly on the West Coast states, the blue states of California and Washington. But Democrats are unlikely to close that significant gap right there. So obviously, President Trump declared victory early Wednesday morning. Yesterday, President Biden spoke and said there would be a peaceful transfer of power. What's next in terms of the presidential election?
Well, now it really comes down to, can Trump correct the mistake that he made the first time around? Even most of Trump's supporters acknowledge that Trump made a big mistake in choosing personnel for the White House. It was a very tumultuous White House, a lot of turnover in personnel, people leaving, people writing books, people later, John Kelly's probably the best example, later going on to trash Trump. And so there's this perception in the Trump camp and with Republicans broadly that Trump's Achilles heel was that he put the wrong people around him. So this is his second chance. He's got to put a new set of people around him. I would say Republicans are a lot more organized this time. They're a lot more prepared. The Republicans admitted last time around that they did not expect him to win in 2016. And so they really weren't prepared for the transition and to govern quickly. And so they were really behind the ball on this one. So this time around, Trump has named his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, who helped run his campaign, is pretty respected in the Republican Party. And, Trump and her are going to have to quickly but effectively and efficiently just line up these cabinet heads, the personnel, and then, all the talk about Project 2025, which was ad nauseum reference in this campaign for some of the policy proposals. And of course, those policy proposals were pretty conservative, and, for that reason, a lot of on the left didn't like them. But Project 2025 started as a resume bank to fill the new administration with Trump loyalists, right? So Project 2025 actually is going to really come in handy right now. People are being vetted. They have this giant bank of resumes that were sort of pre-vetted, and so that they can staff all these agencies with, sort of via the Heritage Foundation's group. And there's a lot of other conservative groups involved, but they can staff the administration with loyalists. And so this is really the next step for Trump. Of course, he's got some policies he wants to lay out, but I think right now it's all personnel.
So Trump essentially ran on a few key issues. The economy, during the Biden-Harris administration, we saw 40-year high inflation, prices up more than 20% since they first took office. Of course, the border crisis with about more than 14 million illegal border crossers, by far an all-time high for any administration. Says he's going to close the border, deport criminal illegal immigrants who are in the country. And then, for lack of a better term, took on sort of the woke America, the woke left, with all these DEI initiatives, things like that. With him in the White House, the Republicans controlling the Senate, likely to control the House. Is he going to be able to get the things done that he wants to get done?
He's going to be able to, but will he do it? I mean, I think it comes down to prioritization, Dan. I've already seen these Republicans, some of these Republicans like vultures, are circling around just ready to supplant Trump's agenda with their own agenda. I think this really did happen last time around in many ways. There's people who are very entrenched in Washington, here where I'm based, who've been doing this for a long time. They know a lot of people. They know the policy forward and backwards. The bills are already written. Dan, there's legislation that's written years ago in the tank waiting for a Republican president. And so what I think Trump's mistake last time was, and I think he has the potential to correct it, but you can only pass so many bills. Like a new president only has the political capital to do a few things. With Obama was such a popular president, but he spent most of his political capital on Obamacare, right? It was a grueling fight that he finally got it passed. And after that, he had some things around the edges, but he couldn't pass 4 Obamacare level things. And, Biden, what did Biden do? He didn't even have anything on the level of Obamacare. He passed a lot of spending, really. He just spent a lot of money. Sometimes with the help of Republicans and sometimes without their help. So I think Trump really has to prioritize if he wants to get anything like this done, because if he starts off with tax reform like he did last time, and then he tries to repeal Obamacare, he might turn around and it's been a year and he hasn't done anything on immigration or the things that he more focused on when he ran for office.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep with all things about the transition of the government and more at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug, with more on ballot initiatives addressing states' laws on abortion and recreational marijuana. We'll now go to Aliana Kernodle.
Voters nationwide approved 7 of 10 ballot initiatives preserving abortion rights, and 5 referendums on marijuana got a mixed response on Tuesday. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Steve Wilson. Steve, what states had ballot initiatives on abortion, and how did they fare?
You had Arizona, Colorado, Maryland, Missouri, Montana, Nevada, and New York, and Florida all had ballot initiatives that would create a carve-out in the state's constitution for abortion rights. And of course, 7 out of those 10 were approved. The big one was Florida. They raised, I think, about $90-something million to pass that, and it came up just short because in Florida, unlike a lot of other states, you've got to have a 60% approval of the voters to get that in the state's constitution.
What were the other states that also didn't pass?
That would be Nebraska was one of those. And strangely enough, they had one that was in opposition, and that one actually passed.
And a handful of states also had referendums on marijuana. How did those fare?
Well, they were a little more mixed results. I mean, Florida, it was, even though it got, I think, 57% of the vote, one marijuana retailer spent the majority of the $153 million that was spent to get that passed. And it was kind of shocking that even though they got 57%, they still fell short because they outspent the opponents of that by 10 times or maybe a little more. So recreational marijuana was rejected by Florida and both Dakotas. And Nebraska voters passed 2 ballot initiatives that establish a medical program in the state. One of them was to set up the program, and the other initiative was to allow people to possess it and buy it. And the interesting thing was, if one of those wouldn't have passed, it wouldn't have worked. You had to pass both to have a medical marijuana program. But I think the biggest thing that sticks out to me is the $271 million raised by the proponents of the 2 Florida initiatives, and how even though the people that were opposed to that were outraised by 20-1, they had an advantage that the proponents did not have. And that was the bully pulpit of Governor Ron DeSantis. He did 12 different events where he laid out a really good case. Governor DeSantis is an attorney, and apparently he's a pretty good one because he laid out a wonderful case to the voters why you shouldn't vote for it. He's like, number one, if you have any doubt about what's in this thing, you should not put it in the Constitution. That's a pretty good argument. The other thing was, he's like, if we want this, we should do it the right way, do it via legislative action, get the legislature to establish a recreational program. And he also pointed out some issues, especially with the marijuana one, that there were some issues with it. There was the fact that the marijuana companies, they would be shielded from civil liability, which is kind of shocking. And the interesting thing he pointed out was the CEO of the marijuana distributor that actually bankrolled this thing, their CEO actually wrote the initiative. So he kept pounding those points in these appearances, and apparently it got through to voters. And I also think because Florida went so big for Trump, bigger than they did in 2016, where it was really a battleground state. And then 2020, it kind of went a little more towards Trump. This time, it was just a blowout. It was a blowout for Republicans, period. And I think that buoyed the case against the abortion amendment and against the recreational marijuana amendment.
And clearly, like you said, the fundraising efforts did not help in Florida, but in other states, it was a very different story. Can you get into that a little bit?
Yes, it's interesting to note that all of these initiatives, they had a lot of money behind them. You had $35 million in Arizona for the abortion one, and opponents only raised $1.34 million. I mean, that's a lot of money. Nevada, similar abortion ballot initiative, they got $11.28 million, and the opposition didn't get any. And in Montana, 18 million compared to 211,150. I mean, money is the mother's milk of politics. And if you can't raise money, it's going to be tough unless you've got an ace in the hole like Governor DeSantis. And, I think the ballot initiative process, one of the things, they got rid of it in my home state of Mississippi. There was a court case, and it was based on, strangely enough, recreational marijuana. But I think the interesting thing about these ballot initiatives is there's a lot of money going into this. This shows that these different national groups are saying, look, we can't influence the legislature, or not enough to get anything done. Why don't we put our money into getting a ballot initiative? Because you got to think about it. This is like a 2-year, 3-year process. Most of these states have a cap on how long they allow you to gather signatures. That's number one. That's expensive. That requires boots on the ground, which is very expensive. You got to pay people to go around and get enough signatures. And it depends state by state. Then you've got to go through the Secretary of State. They've got to endorse the signatures to make sure that there's not any fraudulent ones. There's no Mickey Mouse or Captain Kirk or anything like that. They got to make sure that things are on the up and up. So you got to go through that. Then you've got the possibility of legal challenges. The Florida ones, they had some legal challenges because the proponents of these amendments said that Florida's state government, through the DeSantis administration, was trying to stymie their efforts. So they had to go to court. And billable hours, as you know, with attorneys, they don't come cheap. So if you're going to get one of these things on the ballot, depending on the state, I think the amount of money, it was $271 million in Florida, big state like that, that's what it's going to cost you.
Well, Steve, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Steve. You've been listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the balance of power in Congress, we'll return to Dan McCaleb.
While there are still plenty of votes to be counted, we know now that Republicans are retaking the White House and the U.S. Senate. And while there are a couple of dozen races to be decided in the U.S. House, it appears likely that Republicans will retain the majority in the lower chamber. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, a Republican trifecta? What does that mean?
Well, it means a bad day if you're a Democrat. I mean, worst case scenario, your arch nemesis Donald Trump is taking power, and he's got the Senate and the House to back him to confirm. Of course, the Senate can confirm his appointments quickly, can confirm his judges very quickly. And you might think that 51 senators is enough, or 218 members in the House is enough because you have that majority. But there are always going to be these kind of moderate senators and members of the House who want to fundraise and make a name off of kind of being a balance to Trump. And then maybe they're in purple states, purple districts. So the fact that Trump is on, of course, some of this has to be taken with a grain of salt because votes are still being counted. But in the Senate, he's, got a several senator lead, and that's still being determined just how big that is. But that protects him from one holdout or one defection being able to have a lot of power, a lot of sway. You're going to have to get, a handful of senators to remain in lockstep to oppose any kind of appointments or any kind of legislation. I think that's going to be pretty difficult. In the House, it's maybe a little bit narrower, but there's so many seats, there's a couple dozen seats that still have not been determined, Dan. So we really don't know the fate of the House, but it does look like it's trending Republican, as you said. Polymarket, which is really the website that tracks all the betting markets for betting on the election. And turned out it was actually almost perfectly accurate. A lot of these races, it guessed at one point it perfectly predicted how this presidential election would go. So I think a lot of people are trusting it more now. But right now they have only a 3% chance for Democrats to control the House. So there's a 3%. It could go wrong, but for Republicans, but right now they have it in lock.
Well, let's talk about the Senate here briefly, Casey. As of this morning, Republicans have won 53 of the 100 U.S. Senate seats. So that's clearly a majority. There are Democrats have won 45. So there are two races outstanding. Yesterday, we learned that in Pennsylvania, Republican challenger Dave McCormick was declared the winner over incumbent Democrat, U.S. Senator Bob Casey. Casey has not conceded the race just yet, but McCormick's been declared the winner. That bumped the Republicans to 53. How significant is that?
Well, it's huge. I mean, for Trump to not only win Pennsylvania, but for Republicans to win that very tough seat, to unseat an incumbent Democrat, it just shows you a couple of demographic changes. Primarily, it shows you that Republicans may have actually captured the working class vote in a way that's more substantive or more permanent. Now, it's worth noting that these senators are generally underperforming Trump, but they're still winning. And so, I mean, they don't have the cult of personality that Trump does. And maybe you could probably argue that these Republican senators are running against stronger candidates than Vice President Kamala Harris. That's going to be debated probably for years, whether she was a strong candidate or it was Biden's fault or what. But I think generally she's actually kind of a weak candidate who floundered in her race last minute. And so maybe these Republican senators are running against tougher candidates like Bob Casey. I think Bob Casey's a tough race. And so, but Republicans have been able to, over the last decade, via Trump and really Trump alone, capture the working class voters, in particular working class white men, working class Latinos. And, Trump, Dan, we talked a lot about Hispanic voters and black voters. Generally, black voters did not support Trump as much as some of the polling suggested they would, but Trump still got double the support that he got in 2016 from black voters, a lot of that from black men. And then in Hispanics, Trump actually, it looks like, votes still being counted, all that, but it looks like Trump won the majority of Hispanic voters, which is huge, especially in, Southwest states, Arizona, Nevada, but really all around the country.
In Texas, too, we did a story on the day after the election that border counties in Texas, which are a majority a Hispanic population, have been traditionally Democratic-run counties. Trump won most of them, and it was largely based on the Latino vote going for Trump. So the border crisis certainly had an effect in those counties. But let's briefly switch to the House, Casey. The map I'm looking at now, 280 House seats are needed for a majority. Republicans so far have won 211. Democrats have won 199. So with those couple of dozen races still left, Republicans really only need to win 7 of them to secure the majority.
That's right. 218 needed for the majority. I think, again, Republicans are on track to do that. The vote's still being counted. Why this matters, besides the legislative implication, of course, which is huge, which will apply to these spending bills, these continuing resolutions. And, Obamacare has already been talking about they're going to try to repeal it more fully. But it also saves Trump a lot of headaches. It saves him the headache of another impeachment. It saves him the headache of endless House investigations, and that really can drive the news cycle. I mean, the way that House Republicans were able to just torment Biden by these never-ending investigations into his son, Hunter Biden, and the overseas funding and the millions of dollars. They were going through these questionable bank accounts and the checks to Hunter Biden from family members that seemed suspicious. And it just kept this constant news cycle. It constantly undermined Biden, and it made it more difficult for him to govern. And if Trump can avoid having to deal with that for 2 years, it's going to help him a lot. It's going to help him when he tries to build on the Senate majority, for instance, in 2 years. So there's legislative impact, and there's also just the narrative and the political capital Trump has to spend in this second-term presidency.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. How did state initiatives addressing non-citizen voting fare on Election Day? Can students get around artificial intelligence checking tools with an undetectable AI generator? And what goes into a credit score? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Nearly 86 million cast ballots before Election Day this year, according to the University of Florida's election lab, with 46.7 million voting early in person. Of the 67.4 million mail ballots requested, 39.4 million had been returned by Tuesday evening. This early turnout has nearly doubled the 2022 midterms, when 45.9 million voted early, although it falls short of the record of 101.4 million early votes in the 2020 general election. New York voters have approved a controversial proposal to amend the state constitution to protect gender identity, despite claims from critics who say it will block parents of transgender kids from approving medical decisions and allow biological males to play in women's sports. Proposition 1 will also codify abortion rights in the state constitution and expand protections against discrimination based on race, religion, and gender. Amazon founder Jeff Bezos plans to sell an additional 16.6 million shares of Amazon stock valued at around $3 billion, as disclosed in a recent regulatory filing. Since moving from Washington state to Florida, where there's no capital gains tax, Bezos has sold about $16.5 billion in Amazon shares in 2024. His decision to relocate before these major transactions could mean Washington misses out on substantial tax revenue, as he would have owed the state $70 million per $1 billion sold had he remained a resident. In the federal corruption trial against former House Speaker Michael Madigan, jurors were introduced to the workings of Chicago's political machine. Prosecutors called Dick Simpson, a political science professor emeritus from the University of Illinois at Chicago, to explain how precinct captains and ward structures secure election victories. Prosecutors allege Madigan used his influence to secure $5,000 a month no-show jobs for loyal precinct captains, rewarding them with positions that required minimal or no work as part of maintaining his political power. The city of Los Angeles faces financial strain, having used up half its reserves this fiscal year and now seeking to borrow at least $80 million to cover legal settlement costs. This borrowing could add approximately $20 million in interest payments to the taxpayer burden. Recent settlements include a $38 million payment to the federal government for failing to make enough affordable housing accessible for people with disabilities, alongside other costly payouts related to police actions and infrastructure issues. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on state initiatives to outlaw non-citizen voting, we'll go back to Eliana Kernodle.
Voters across multiple states cast ballots on who should be allowed to join them at the polls in referenda directed to voting rights, including the issue of non-citizen voting. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Shirlene Guerra. Shirlene, what states had ballot initiatives on non-citizen voting, and how did they fare?
Well, actually, every ballot measure prohibiting non-citizen voting ended up being approved overwhelmingly by 52% or more in Iowa, Idaho, Kentucky, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Wisconsin.
And this isn't the beginning of this conversation, though. There have been other measures in other states and on the national level addressing this question in the past. Can you lay out the background?
Yeah. So while each state's constitution does mention U.S. citizenship as being a requirement for voting, the laws on non-citizen voting vary from each state. And though these bans on non-citizen voting on the state level gained more traction in recent years, Alabama, Colorado, Florida, Louisiana, North Dakota, and Ohio actually banned it from 2018 up until 2022. Right now, the current states that already prohibit non-citizen voting are Arizona, Colorado, North Dakota, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, and Ohio. However, there are certain jurisdictions in California, Maryland, and Vermont that actually permit voting on the local level.
Yeah, so what's the national policy on this question?
Yeah, so non-citizen voting is still prohibited, on a national level everywhere in presidential elections and things like that.
These states that had these ballot measures, many of them also had other questions about voting rights or methods in there as well. What were some of those?
Yeah, so Iowa voters actually had said yes to prohibiting the state and local governments from allowing non-citizens to vote and allowing 17-year-olds who will be 18 by the general election to vote in primary elections. While Missouri voters had said yes to prohibiting the ranked choice voting and preventing the state, local, and government from allowing non-citizens to vote in elections. There were some other ballot initiatives passed in Nevada, and it passed by 74%, which enacted a voter identification requirement, while one ballot measure in Connecticut authorized laws for no excuse absentee voting, and that had actually passed by 57%.
Well, Shirlene, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Shirlene. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on an artificial intelligence generator that claims to be undetectable and its implications for cheating, we'll return to Eliana Kernodle.
With the rising popularity of generative artificial intelligence, which allows users to enter prompts or questions and receive text or answers, students can cheat in ways they couldn't just a few years ago. And now they can do it even better with programs like Stealth GPT. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, what is this program?
Yeah, Stealth GPT bills itself as a humanizer for artificial intelligence created text. So I think we're all pretty aware at this point that if you go to an AI, it's called a GPT. If you go to like a like Chat GPT or different kinds of AI, like Gemini, different Claude, there's these different kinds of agents or that will generate text. You can say, hey, like write me an essay on George Washington's experience, cutting down the cherry tree, for example, or like why that was formative in his life. And then it'll give you and say, I needed 600 words long. I need it to sound like this. I need to sound like a kid wrote it. And then you try to do that. It'll spit it out and it'll give you something that will, read cohesively and include the different things that you tell it to. And basically you ask it for information into the best of its ability using what's called a large language model. It'll come back at you with the information that it thinks that you want. And so that's I think we're all pretty familiar with that. Maybe we've used it or I've seen other people use it or played around with it. But it kind of has popped up in a lot of different sectors of our society, right? From ads to to listings. People wanted to write about selling their car, or to writing your school, your school papers, right? And I've also seen a news account of a lawyer who received professional penalization for using it to write a brief for the court, and then it was discovered that something that is cited was wrong, and so then he had to admit, oh yeah, I used AI to write this, and lost his law license, if I remember that correctly. So there are these different areas where this has been used, and this Stealth GPT basically says if you use us, we'll take that text and we'll convert it to something that can be identified as AI. So currently, you can use programs like Turnitin or Grammarly or Zero GPT. And basically try to find out whether or not the text was written by AI. If you get a piece back, hey, it looks a little bit fishy, I'm going to put it in here and see. But this Stealth GPT says it's traceless AI-generated content that does not get flagged by Turnitin. And they say that they are constantly, trying it against some of these, the best detectors to ostensibly not get caught. Like that's the whole point, is that you can write your essay, and then you can use this to sort of scramble the text and make it look more human and make it look more like a human wrote it and like AI didn't write it, and then turn it in, bada bing, bada boom, you're good, right? So that's really the premise there. And it's kind of similar to Goth Math or Goth AI, which is an app that we've written about, and I believe we've discussed on here as well, which was owned by ByteDance, which is the parent company of TikTok. Which, kind of has its own conversation attached with it. But basically you can take a picture of your homework and it'll give you the answers. And there's an aspect of Stealth GPT that will do that too, where you can take a picture and do that. So there's like that full range of services. So that in a nutshell, that's what Stealth GPT is trying to do.
So then what's kind of the branding around this? What is the official stance of the company?
Yeah, I think the conversation around it is you can use this to get away with using AI writing. And it's hard from a legal point of view, or, if you're a company like this, like how far out do you go and say that? And so like in promotional materials, or like and this is what we saw with Goth AI too, is that, it's saying like you can use this, or like that students can sign up for this, or, this will make your life easier, or you can do all of your things in one place. And ostensibly, like if you're reading that as a student, you're like, wow, this would make my life so much easier. I can use this to write all the papers that I want and I won't get caught. And so there's a lot of that happens, like, with the subtext of like students are already looking for the solutions. There's a lot of different solutions out there, but this is better than all of them because it's undetectable, right? So that's really the branding behind it, is that it's undetectable, that there is like that need for that in the market. And that's something that its creator talked about too, was like, this is basically allowing people to do what they are going to do anyway. Or like to if there's already AI out there, we're just going to kind of help them along, and we're going to kind of burn down the academic institutions and the integrity of that. And like, basically they don't have any standing anymore anyway. And so this is going to help. And if you ask, there's an AI agent that you can kind of talk with on StealthGPT's website, which is not, it says like, I'm an agent, you can talk to me, but I'm not undetectable. So just, with that, like, when you salt. But you can ask it questions about what StealthGPT can do, and you can ask it, if you ask it, can you write papers for a middle school student? That it says, yes, you can, like, where it's designed to help students at all levels, including middle school, with their writing assignments. So, even if you ask that question of the AI agent that's designed to answer questions about it, that's what you get back. So I think for all intents and purposes, it's like, yes, you can use this for whatever purpose. It could be your blog, and there's other marketing that is done by the company, specifically towards those who have like small businesses, for example, and they want to write a blog and have it with a lot of SEO keywords, but they don't want to get downplayed by Google, different kinds of search engines that are moving away from AI created writing. So this would say like, okay, you can still use AI writing, but then, and not get penalized for it. So, you can save money or save time. You don't have to buy a content writer. You don't have to do any of this stuff. So there are other uses as well. And just kind of an aside with that, the creator in an interview said that he had heard from PhD students saying that they're writing their thesis with StealthGPT. So just kind of like an aside there of like, there's a lot of different levels of people who are using this and employing it, for their own ends.
But is the official stance that you're not supposed to use it to cheat?
Yeah. So like the main message is like, you can use this for whatever you need to avoid detection. But then, in its terms of service, it says students cannot use it to cheat, right? So there's like that, again, like what we saw with Goth AI, where it's like, officially don't do anything that would violate, your institution's academic policies, right? Or your school, like, don't go against your school code. And this one specifically, it says that it's promoted to academic integrity and prohibits any form of academic dishonesty, including plagiarism, cheating, collusion, fabrication, and facilitating dishonest acts. And that they're expected to use their services and resources ethically and responsibly, and adhering to the principles of academic honesty. And that, if you don't do that, then you could have a warning, a temporary suspension, permanent ban, or account termination, and that they reserve the right to determine the appropriate consequence for any violation and cooperate with relevant authorities and educational institutions as required by law or upon request. So again, if somebody asks, are you using this? Again, like, and so it's one of those questions of like, how would they ever know that your stuff was StealthGPT if it actually did make it undetectable? And kind of raises questions of, if you're using this and then, an organization asks StealthGPT, do you have any users with our email address? Would they comply? Would they say yes and then turn you over? It's one of those questions of like, and from the interview, it sounded like the founder, Joseph Gurman, he said, I do have the names of everybody who's used it. I have their email addresses at least. And so I have an idea of like where they're coming from. And students that have, their .edu, they get a discount. So I think there might be ways to do that. So it's one of those questions of how untraceable is this, like by law, would they have to give stuff over if asked? And it kind of raises questions related to that. So yeah. So again, like what we saw with Goth AI, you have sort of an official policy and then, the unofficial marketing saying kind of different things about what the service provides.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks, Eliana and Brendan, for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss credit scores, PhD economist, Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, so we were doing some show prep this week, just trading some text messages and checking in on each other. I tossed out this idea, and you're indulging me, and I appreciate that. There are a lot of younger Americans who are sort of like kind of making their way in the world, getting started.
Forget about younger Americans. I mean, I get a notification, "Ooh, your credit score went up." I'm like,
Well, that's where I'm headed with this. Like, where does your credit score come from? I mean, in particular for young, I was focusing on younger people because, your credit score starts to matter when you want to start to do stuff like get your own apartment, like buy your first car, like, buy your first house, of course, and sort of like that progression. Not everybody goes in that order.
There are people that won't get married to somebody with a low credit score. So it matters, man.
Yeah.
It matters. If you're still out there dating, well, your finances matter.
Yeah. Right.
So it's, it's a house, it's a car, it's even marriage. It can affect things, for the rest of your future. And so really, really important to get that right.
So talk to me about how a credit score comes about. I mean, I have my middle daughter is, in her senior year of high school. And so, we've made some college visits. And as I was walking around at a university this past week, credit card application materials are readily available, for, college students, and credit card companies would love for the next generation to start to become credit card holders and carriers. That seems to be where it begins, I think, but I don't know that for sure. So, I mean, what is the pathway to building a credit score?
Exactly. I mean, the earlier, the better. And I'll tell you why. There are a couple of factors that go into your credit score. Your payment history, of course. Once you have a credit card, the ability to pay your bills on time, because late payments, delinquencies, bankruptcies, account sent in collection will negatively impact 35% of your score, right? That's the weight they put on payment history. Credit utilization. So they want you to use your credit, but not use it too much, right? If you're using too much of your credit, it's usually a signal that perhaps you're either not earning enough, or you're in some sort of financial crunch and you're having to resort on credit. And so that makes up 30% of your credit score.
Mm-hmm.
The length of your credit history. The longer you've had credit for, the better off you are, right? Mm-hmm. The age of your oldest account, and the average age of all your accounts really matters, right? So which is why I said it's important to start early, right? Establishing credit when you're, a young adult at 18 going to college, I think it's a good idea. And keeping those accounts active and open for a long time is going to help your credit score. That's 15% of your score.
Mm-hmm.
Then they look at your credit mix. And when I say they, it's the credit bureaus. So the credit mix is going to be, does this person only have a bunch of credit cards? Or does he have a mortgage or an auto loan, right? Having a good mix means that you're probably very good at paying your bills on time. And so lenders find you, an attractive prospect, right? They know that they can lend money to you and that you will pay it back on time with interest. And so they like that. They like those people, right? Who pay their bills on time and make them money by paying them interest, essentially. And so having a good credit mix, is going to positively affect your credit score. And that counts for about 10% of your credit score. Now, new credit inquiries. So like every time you want to open a new credit card or get a loan or whatever, somebody is going to have to check your credit history, right? To make sure you're someone they could feel comfortable lending to. And so credit, new credit and credit inquiries actually temporarily lower your credit score. If you have too many of them, it could be a sign that you're desperate to get access to funds, right? And so they'll look at that and say, well, hold on a second. This person has applied for, 5 or 6 credit cards in a 2-week period. Maybe they're in some sort of financial crunch. And so they may borrow and not be able to repay. And so that negatively affects your credit score. So that kind of sums it up, in terms of what are the factors that matter for the credit score that you end up with.
Yeah. So, in summary, if you're just starting out, go ahead, get a credit card. That's fine. Pay your bill. That's important.
The first thing is keep the spending small.
Yes.
Because you don't want to use too much of your credit, right? You have a credit limit, but you don't want to use it all up, right? Because that's usually a sign to lenders that something's wrong with your finances. So you want to use a small portion of that allocated or allotted credit, and then just, and use it and then repay it on time. I personally advise to pay your full bill at the end of each billing cycle, or even before the end of the billing cycle. It's a sign that you're in control of your finances, and lenders see that as a positive thing, and they see it as hey, this person, we can trust this person, can be trusted to borrow more, to borrow often, because they often repay on time and maybe even before the billing cycle's over.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. It's a little bit different for us, but I think it's important for us to talk about real things that affect real people, and just, with this entire group of...
And it's never too late to start. It's never too late to start. In fact, it's not impossible to even come back from a bankruptcy, right? Yeah. And end up with an 800 plus, right? With a very high credit score. So, don't throw your hands up in the air, right? It's important to look at your bills, to look at your finances, to set yourself up for success. Don't bury your head in the sand, right? Grab the mail, open up the bills, look at your finances, and make a plan, right? Is the advice that I give to people. I talk to people in the housing market all the time. Make a plan, right? There are plenty of tools out there, that are available to help you navigate your finances, but also maybe get in the housing market if that's what you're after.
I appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. The Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Kernodle. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.